Today is October 25th that it's being recorded, and the topic has to do with energy, international energy policy, and all the rest. I'm aware of the fact that in recent days, and before I conceived this topic, uh, there have been, or I conceived the topic before the recent days, let me put it correctly. Lots of coverage has been given in the newspapers and on the media because of the forthcoming International Glasgow Conference. But let me backtrack a little bit and contextualize even that conference. Um, the mess that we're in is fairly clear. By we, I mean the United States and most other countries. And I suppose the first thing to inquire about is why are there all of a sudden all these energy bottlenecks and holdups and so forth? Um, there are not single explanations. Some of the explanations have to do with countries being responsive to climate change and therefore closing coal mines, not investing money in new oil rigs, oil drilling, trying to convert to more sensible, environmental friendly sources of energy. And as a consequence, the new sources of energy, while they provide a certain percentage of energy resources, do not provide enough to meet the current needs for energy. And why are the current needs expanding or seemingly expanding? Well, one of the reasons is that because of COVID, believe it or not, while the economies shrank, but while the economies shrank in many countries, the kind of globalization of the economy, that is to say, shipping things overseas, depending on access to overseas imports, actually increased in some areas. So while in some ways you have a feeling that COVID must dampen the economy, aspects of the economies, whether it's through Amazon or through just the shipments, let's say, between China and the United States, actually expanded, and the consumption patterns during COVID changed. Now, as COVID is being managed better in many parts of the world, in addition to the consumption patterns having changed or accelerated, for example, of buying of televisions and other hard goods, some of the current expansions are due to the fact that people are, for example, going back to work and therefore using more gasoline. And so COVID is one of the factors that has changed the both domestic and international consumption patterns for energy. That's the second area. The third area has to do with climate change coming in a different direction. Namely, lots of places have been hotter and colder due to climate change. And the consequence of that is that people are burning fossil fuels and have the need to, for example, heat their homes. And so you need the production that is brought forward, excuse me, both from increased productions in factories and trade and shipment, but also household increases of consumption, having to do with either heating homes or else cooling them due to incredible heat patterns. So climate change in and of itself has changed the need for energy and different energy sources in different locations. So it's like a perfect storm. A number of variables, COVID, climate change in terms of changing energy sources, as well as climate change producing different weather patterns, all combine to having brought havoc to the energy market, both within countries and amongst countries. So let's take the US for a moment. You have probably all noticed that gasoline prices are increasing. They increase more in California than other parts of the country, but very soon, probably within the next few months, we will be paying $5, $6 for gasoline. Why is there a gasoline shortage? Well, all the reasons I've mentioned before, not least of which is that trying to address climate change and using wind and solar and all of these non-polluting energy sources has expanded a whole lot. But when the consumption of energy simultaneously expands, the amount of energy that you can garner from, let's say, wind farms or solar can't be expanded very rapidly. So the only way to expand that is through the expansion of the older, dirtier coal, oil, and gas expansion. So that then gets you back to how quickly can those be expanded? And that depends on what country you're living in. Some countries have the capacity to expand the utilization of gas. Now, gas is less polluting than coal, right? So they've morphed from coal to gas, but in many cases, the gas is procured not inside the country. In the US it is, but in many countries in Europe and elsewhere, the gas for heating, for example, and cooling, has to come from somewhere else. Where does it have to come from? Well, in Europe, largely Russia, right? In some other parts of the country, there are other neighboring countries that may have gas production of one kind or another. Well, that too then depends, as it does, I might also say, with gasoline and oil, on the countries that have those resources and the degree to which they're willing or able to quickly expand them. So, for example, Russia has the capacity to expand the shipment of gas to Europe so that they can heat their homes and keep their factories going. But for various political reasons, it may not choose to do so. Right. So that kind of expansion then leaves Europe in a situation where the move into wind and solar energy sources can't be expanded for technological reasons. It can't be done so very quickly. And at the same time, alternative resources, for example, like gas, can't be acquired if the Russians are unwilling to expand their exports. So Europe is stuck between, sort of two hard places. It's done all the right things for climate change, but when you all of a sudden need, because of weather, for example, and also consumption of products that require energy to produce, they're not in a position to acquire the resources. So it begins to look like Europe will experience a rather cold winter, and European countries are very alarmed about that. In the United States, what is due to the increase in gasoline prices? Well, American oil companies have not expanded their search for new oil sources, because where has the payoff been? The payoff has been to move into alternative energy resources, gas, other energy resources. So they're not in a capacity, for example, oil companies in Texas and elsewhere, they're in no position to very quickly ramp up. So the ramping up in cases of newly required requirements by consumers is not necessarily something that companies can turn around and quickly do. Take another country, take a country like China. China, as you know, is very heavily dependent on coal still, right? And it's also trying to expand into non-coal energy sources, but that's a slow process. Why is there all of a sudden an electric shortage in some parts um, of, of China? They have no blackouts, no electricity all of a sudden, may run into deep difficulty this winter when it's cold. And that simply is because the society, as the economy has grown, the energy sources have not grown. And of course, they're not supposed to grow the energy sources of more coal mines, although actually the Chinese are opening more coal mines and mining more. But in any event, they're also meant to move into other energy sources, not because we want them to, but also because of the pollution in China itself. So you can walk around from country to country, be it be it India, be it the United States, be it Europe, China, and find that almost everybody in the world in this month of October is facing climate generated changes, colder and hotter, and at the same time expanding economies in the post-COVID era, or because of COVID, depending on the nature of the economy, and an inelasticity to quickly produce in increased energy sources, and of course difficulties in producing energy sources which themselves move into more or less polluting areas. That is, say, gasoline pollutes 50% less, roughly speaking, than coal. If gasoline, I'm sorry, gas, I don't mean gasoline, gas. So if gas production can't be quickly ramped up, right, you either move back to coal production if you're able to, or you're caught in a vice. Now, let me say one more time that, why is it that all these wonderful advances that have been made in terms of solar, in terms of wind farms, and so forth, can pick up the gap? Well, because they are difficult to expand. A wind farm is of a particular size, especially in Northern Europe, Norway, and so forth, has huge wind farms. But the wind farms produce whatever the wind produces, and they can quickly put in more wind farms, and they can force more wind for the wind farms to produce more energy. Now, what I'm saying is not in some ways as rigid as it sounds, because there are now technological fixes. For example, you can save the energy from wind farms, and new battery mechanisms, new saving mechanisms are available to save when there is wind and then deploy the energy source when it's needed. But this is all very complicated and is helpful in some parts of the world and in some countries, but it's not a cure-all. So what is there to be done? Well, you know, um, we're stuck, actually. Uh, Homes need to be heated, electricity needs to be generated. How can you generate and use less electricity? Well, it's begun to happen in the sense that some factories in some countries in the world have already closed down because they need too much energy to produce whatever, for example, cement plants and so forth. They need too much energy to produce their product, and the energy is either too expensive now and therefore not cost effective, or alternatively, the governments are just decreeing you must stop. You can only use X amount of energy. Now, the problem here is that on the one hand, one is describing technological barriers that are not well matched with economies as they currently exist and are growing. On the other hand, one is also having to deal with interference mechanisms, such as changes in the economy due to COVID, for example, changes in the economy because of consumption patterns changing, changes in the economies because of weather changes, right? Uh, so there are all kinds of variables, and in some ways, addressing the problem is keeping gazillions of balls in the air simultaneously. Now, why is this an international problem? Well, because most countries are not self sufficient. That is to say, their economies are interdependent because of globalization, and globalization also exists in the energy world. So that you can't just say, well, all right, we are having a problem and we can fix it. Many countries are not in a position to unilaterally fix their energy situation. By that, I mean either having access to their energy needs, secondly, having access to cleaner energy sources, such as gas rather than oil and coal, and of course a lack of flexibility or elasticity amongst the contemporary energy sources, which are meant to clean up the climate and, or if not clean it up, at least address climate change issues. So we're having a perfect storm out there, and this is the first year where this perfect storm has become an international problem. Now, if I point out that individual countries mostly can't fix their problems, that is to say, they can't just simply mine more coal and continue to dirty their environment, or they can't get more oil out of the ground because the oil rigs produce only so much, or because they can't get more energy out of solar and wind farms and so forth. They are therefore dependent or interdependent on countries that have more flexibility. So let's take the issue of oil and gasoline. It would be possible, for example, for Saudi Arabia and the other oil producing countries in the Middle East to ramp up oil production and therefore supply Europe and other parts of the world with additional oil resources, which would have two consequences. First, you would have the available oil for heating and gasoline. And second of all, you would not have those sharp price increases. Well, some of the oil producing countries are just sort of thumbing their noses and saying, no, we're not going to do that. For political reasons, if not for economic reasons. So while on the one hand, production and consumption is globalized, some countries hold in their hands the resources to help countries that don't have the resources, or at least don't have the capacity to quickly ramp things up, and are therefore playing politics. Another example is Russia. Russia could very much increase its gas siphoned or sent to Europe, right? And that would help Europe a lot. Well, so far, Russia has not done so. And that gives it some political leverage. So what in some senses is a resource issue and economic issue that is globalized, it is also the case that them who have are not necessarily willing to help those that don't have, and not for economic reasons, but for political reasons. So the idea of cooperation and coordination to help countries which will be in deep distress, not just because of shortages, for example, not enough heating for homes and not enough energy for the production of goods here, there, and yonder, but are also, just deeply playing politics and deeply being uncooperative because what they want to do is to, achieve political leverage. Now, looking at this that's sort of at the international and global level. Looking at it from the domestic perspective, one has a different kind of issue. I mean, most citizens of most countries will blame their governments rather than, distant Russia or Saudi Arabia, if they don't have enough to heat their homes, or if transportation becomes out of sight because the cost of gasoline has become so high. So this bounces into domestic politics. And here one could just mention the US. I mean, when gasoline hits, $6, let's say, people are going to be pretty mad and they're going to blame the Biden administration. Whom will Republicans blame? Republicans will blame the policies of not expanding coal production and closing down some coal production and not fostering American and multinational companies from expanding their oil production and looking for setting up and new oil discovery mechanisms and new ways to quickly produce more oil. So so you're not particularly interested in climate change or the environment. You're interested in the fact that your heating bill goes sky high, and so does your gasoline bill. I mean, here in California, I think we can expect, for those of us who have gas heating in our homes, we can expect the price to double this winter, right? So who are we going to blame, right? And having a kind of a sophisticated notion that this is all in the long-term interest of slowing down climate change sounds very good sort of ideologically, philosophically, but does not necessarily key into the political responses that people will have. And so I'm actually anticipating quite a lot of political difficulty, both for the Biden administration, for the government, let's say, of the new government of Germany, and so forth. Now, there are, of course, isolated different explanations. For example, you probably have read in the papers or heard on the news that there are gasoline shortages at the pumps in Great Britain. And that is really self-imposed shooting yourself in the foot due to Brexit, because you simply don't have the trucks and the truck drivers to bring the gasoline into England because of the disruptions caused by England leaving, the United Kingdom leaving Brexit. So that is sort of it's very sad for the UK, but that is sort of a self-induced shooting yourself in the foot because of Brexit, and the British government has all kinds of explanations for it. But if you look, behind the curtains, what you can see is that the whole transportation, because of not having truck drivers, not having trucks, all kinds of slowdowns due to inspection, are really the cause of the UK's problem. That is not true in the rest of Europe, and that is not true in Asia and in Latin America and in Africa. So I don't want to homogenize the causalities of everybody's problems. But I do want to say that both the need to expand energy sources and the need to do something to stop the environment from making global climate change worse are overlapping with each other, and in very dire situations in the cold climates this winter and in the hot climates in terms of cooling mechanisms and all the rest. What is the solution? Are there solutions? Yes, of course there are solutions. Solutions are to rev up alternative energy sources. Many solutions have to do with technological changes and new inventions. For example, one of the spin-offs of energy sources and helping global climate change, warming the climate, is not just carbon dioxide, but methane, and which is far more, in some senses, polluting than even carbon dioxide. There's now technology to capture the methane, so that in some senses the fixes are not just sort of airy fairy, but in fact they're technological inventions which will help. But some of these, are somewhat slow to come aboard, and so one can't expect them to develop overnight. So the existing climate change that we already have, never mind if climate change gets worse, the existing weather change and weather patterns, the existing globalization, which links both energy transmission as well as the economies together, are creating a situation that the world has never seen. It is really unique. And, how are some governments' plans better than others? Sure. One small wrinkle I just want to mention is that, over time, the dangers of nuclear energy have made themselves manifest. After the Japanese nuclear plant accident, the Germans closed down their nuclear plant. Other nuclear plants that are aging in the US and elsewhere have been shuttered down. And of course, nuclear energy, if there are no nuclear accidents with them, are a fairly clear, clean energy source. So, for example, France, which has heavily invested in nuclear energy and gets a far greater proportion of its energy sources from nuclear than most other European countries, is in a better position than, let's say, Germany or Italy. So the nuclear discussion, I think, will be revved up. Is it really wise to close all the nuclear plants and move away from nuclear? And that's sort of a separate scientific and safety discussion. That's a kind of a side discussion right now, but you can tell by looking at France how relatively better off they are. So what can we expect? What we can expect, it seems to me, is in the US is very high prices for gasoline and gas heating and electricity in the months to come. We can expect that Republicans will make hay out of this and blame the Biden administration for this. What we can expect is that the Glasgow meeting, which will happen soon, will lead to a fair amount of serious discussion, because lots of the people attending it will recognize that at the home front, energy and the price of energy is no longer a kind of niche issue for environmentalists, but is now hitting everyone. Will Glasgow make big inroads? Maybe not. Apart from consciousness raising, it's not even clear that either Putin or, for that matter, Xi in China will actually go to the climate conference, which is not a good development. But I think consciousness raising in and of itself may have some merit. Will they accomplish a lot? Hard to say. But there is now a lot of pressure from their home countries that as people, as individuals and citizens are beginning to feel the energy crunch and the energy price difficulties and the economic impact on households, there, I think, will be a public relations issue that did not even exist in Paris, and certainly not in years before. I want one small wrinkle before I close, and that has to do with what about poor countries in the world, in Africa, parts of Asia, Latin America, but mainly in the ever-growing, in terms of population, African continent. They will come to the Glasgow meeting in the same way that they came in 1992 to the Rio conference, which was the first conference, asking for help for them to address climate change. And it will be interesting to see whether or not the wisdom of those coming from more industrialized countries that they need help because they are an ever increasing portion of the global population will be taken seriously rather than sort of airy fairy promises which say, oh, yes, we're going to help you guys. And then, in fact, no help is forthcoming. The global energy crisis that is looming, as well as the global climate change crisis that is here and, of course, will accelerate, cannot be resolved just by industrial countries' policies. It needs to include the poorer countries of the world. So I've rambled on a bit, and you no doubt have had a fair enough that you've managed to read in the paper because everybody is talking about it. But I just wanted to emphasize that we're dealing with a new crisis. We're dealing with a national American crisis. We're dealing with a global crisis. We're dealing with an energy crisis. We're dealing with an environmental crisis. We're dealing with climate change crises. And all of a sudden, I think it becomes apparent, even people who have not been environmental activists, that these are meshed and interrelated. And we better think about it, not in isolation, but rather the interdependence of the energy sources, the interdependence of our own countries with other countries, the interdependence politically, the interdependence economically, even if countries like the United States will say, oh, we're going to have more domestic production and less global trade and so forth. Globalization is here to change, to stay, even if modest adjustments get to be made. And if globalization is here to stay economically in terms of energy sources, in terms of the environment, we better continue to think globally and not just nationally or not just in terms of California or Santa Cruz. So bottom line, this is a huge international issue and not just a domestic issue, either in the United States or in any particular part of the world. Thank you for listening and see you again in 2 weeks.